You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Koku. Glad to be back here again. Today we are reading a paper on Marcus Garvey and African unity. Lessons for the future from the past. I think we need unity now more than probably ever. Before I get into it, I want to remind you guys that this show is a part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio. There are other shows on the network I would suggest you also check out.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Also, make sure you check out the Queen's Council Podcast, also here on KWAZ Radio. Dorico Kubo Photography is in the chat, saying peace, family, peace to Dorico. And he says that it is not that people are not commenting on Garvey content. The powers that be just don't want Garvey content trending. That will just derail the reality they're trying to create. I agree with that too. I agree with that. Rico also says hit the like button to show attendance. I'd appreciate that. You guys don't just listen in silence, or at least if you listen in silence, click the like button, you know. But I appreciate Rico Kubo Photography for being here. I also appreciate the insight he gives on the Discord. We have a Discord server, the Bitter Medicine Podcast. If you look at the top of the chat or in the description of this episode, you'll see the link. You can click that and join the Discord. But on the Discord, Dorico always drops some stock tips, some investment tips in general, you know, so you guys should be on the Discord. And you need to be tuned into the game that you're being given about investing. Remember, at the start of the year, our pledge to ourselves was to be about abundance, right? Health, wealth, relationships. And so join the Discord and get those tips in and actually follow through with it. I see the Pro-Black Perspective is here saying peace, peace. Peace to you too, brother. I figured the Pro-Black Perspective would be here once we're talking about Garvey and all, but he's usually here anyway, so I appreciate him either way. All right. Okay. Now that that is out of the way, Marcus Garvey and African Unity: Lessons for the Future from the Past by Mark Christian of Miami University. This article primarily considers African unity via the insights and struggle of Marcus Garvey and the UNIA and African Communities League, or the ACL, in the 1920s. Garvey provided a blueprint in relation to the psychological welfare of peoples of African descent globally. The UNIA had chapters in Africa, Europe, the Caribbean, and the Americas, espousing the ideology of psychological betterment that would lead to quote-unquote Africa for the Africans at home and abroad. There are many lessons from African independence leaders learned from Marcus Garvey, and in the 21st century, there is the need for greater cooperation between black peoples of African descent on the continent, who continue to cope with, among other things, the legacy of European colonialism and dysfunctional African leadership in the post-colonial era. Crucially, the present maladies of HIV/AIDS, sporadic civil war, and poor distribution of health services make the notion of African unity imperative. So here's a quote from Garvey. All right, here's a quote from Garvey that says, "At the present time, the world is not producing enough food to feed all its inhabitants. The strong are fed and the weak starve. That is why there are famines in certain countries, even though those countries produce certain things for human consumption. The strong go there and take the food and send it home, just as how Great Britain and France go into Africa, take out the products and ship them away to feed Europeans and leave Africans to starve. The strong will always live at the expense of the weak." That's Garvey in 1923. Has much changed since that time? Here's a quote by Kwame Nkrumah, 1961. "I can see no security for African states unless African leaders like ourselves have realized beyond all doubt that salvation for African lies in unity. For in unity lies strength. And as I see it, African states must unite or sell themselves out to imperialists and colonialist exploiters for a mess of pottage, or disintegrate individually." Yes, sir. So again, I want to thank everyone who's here in attendance, listening as we get into this paper. All right, thank you guys for being here. A caveat at the outset is to acknowledge that this article should be regarded as a glance back at the past to make some sense of the present and future. It could be seen as folly to try to compress a theme that involves the entire African continent into a brief article, but there are markings along the road that make the theme readily accessible to the reader. That stated, in our age of globalization, Marcus Garvey's 1920 cry of Africa for the Africans at home and abroad, and Kwame Nkrumah's call for African unity in the 60s, to some now probably seems to be a distant attempt to liberate and unify the many peoples of African descent. In hindsight, Garvey's African liberation plea was largely dismissed in the 1920s, and he was often ridiculed as an idealist for having the audacity to espouse the overthrow of European colonialism in Africa. This is not to suggest that the European imperialists did not fear the UNIA and Marcus Garvey. They certainly did. In hindsight, Garvey was actually prescient, as Africa would eventually come to, quote unquote, free itself from direct European rule largely by the 1980s. The fall of apartheid in the 1990s would certainly break the back of direct European rule and the age of overt white supremacist social policy in South Africa. Yet in reading the available social indicators, Africa presently remains by and large tethered in poverty, endemic diseases, and mounting national debt crisis. If this is not depressing enough, there is also a relative lack of unity among African nations that seemingly have far more in common than they do in difference. Regardless of the efforts to create some long-term recovery and unity among African nations, such as the initiatives established since the mid-1970s, such as the Economic Community of West African States, the Brandt Commission, and Live Aid in the 1980s, and a more recent Partnership for Africa's Development, not enough is being done to combat the myriad economic and social problems currently faced by the continent. There is some hope for a common assault on the myriad problems encountered within the continent with the March 2001 development of an African Union, consisting of over 40 African heads of state and government, which replaced the Organization of African Unity. Although it is too soon to be over-optimistic, the African Union is a major step toward the Pan-African vision of a United States of Africa. It will certainly take an exceptional amount of diplomacy to undo the many perceived largely European-derived differences among African nations because of the effects of colonialism and its aftermath. So this paper is like from 2008, I believe, and they reference what happened in March 2001, the creation of the African Union. What are you guys' thoughts on the African Union? I may have asked this in some form in a previous episode, but as it stands today, what's your current perceptions or thoughts on the African Union? You know, if you're here live with me, you could type that into the chat room. I'll read it live on the air. If not, you could post it in the comment section and we'll have a dialogue about it there. To continue, the article considers the notion of African unity in regard to past efforts to secure a blueprint for empowerment and enable African nations to work more productively in tackling the problems that beset the entire continent. The argument for a unified Africa has been made before, so why has it been so difficult to develop? Why? Who is to blame for the continued stagnation? These questions are at the heart of the contemporary underdevelopment and poor health of Africa. Unlike previous generations, the present and future have to face the pandemic of AIDS, and it is more than ever necessary to find commonality among African nations to defeat it. So we had a section called "Where Does the Culpability Lie?" Where does the culpability lie? Pro-Black Perspective is in chat room and says AU, African Union, is a dictator's club, or whatever I've heard. Derico Cooper Photography says the African Union was going hard in the paint until I guess Derico had to edit his comments. I'll come back to it in a bit. Right? We're at this section of paper called "Where Does Culpability Lay?" Who is to blame for the contemporary decline of Africa? Most often, the West has pointed to poor African leadership in the immediate post-colonial era. No one could seriously argue against the idea of poor African leadership in the post-colonial era. Two of the most notorious and Western-backed African dictators were Uganda's Idi Amin, who lived from, I guess, 1925 to 2003, and Zaire's Mobutu Sese Seko, 1930 to 1997. Amin and Mobutu each plundered their respective nations' wealth, ushering in the facetious term kleptocracy for African states enduring dictatorship via the kleptomaniac rule of certain African leaders. We need to keep in mind that the CIA backed for decades the leadership of Mobutu, as it suited the United States in terms of the geopolitics of Cold War containment. Yet it should also be noted that the unstable state of Africa has historical roots dating back to both European enslavement and colonialism. Quote-unquote blame for contemporary conditions ought to include the effects of the past and unfortunate empowerment of African dictators backed by Western power. In this sense, Africa in the 21st century has to be encouraged internally to resist both military-based and dictatorial heads of state. It may be deemed rather idealistic to think of an African continent working for itself and via itself, but this ought to be the primary concern and focus of the African Union. Who agrees with that, yes or no? Should this be the concern of the African Union? Ali Mazrui, 1999, puts forward a useful analysis for understanding the current marginalization of African nations under the present world schema of globalization, especially compared to the era of the Cold War. Professor Mazrui draws his analysis from Walter Rodney's now classic book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and creatively turns Rodney's thesis on its head to read How Africa Developed the West, right? Quote unquote, How Africa Developed the West. The main point he makes is to link Africa's demise from the West's takeoff to its now globalization phase. As Mazrui writes, Africa and African people made a far bigger contribution to the technological revolution of the West than the West did to industrial change in Africa. Each step in Africa's contribution to the development of the West was itself a stage in the history of globalization. The era of labor imperative was when the labor of Africa's sons and daughters was what the West needed for its industrial takeoff. The slave ship helped export millions to the Americas to help in the agrarian revolution in the Americas and the industrial revolution in Europe simultaneously. The enforced dispersal of black people to serve Western capitalism was itself part of the emerging globalization. For Mazrui, Africa was a source of riches for Europe in terms of enslaved labor during the 15th to 19th centuries on raw materials from the 19th to the present. The extent of both to the demise of the continent is taken up in Rodney's work, but Mazrui says that we have missed in his analysis the opposite, quote unquote, how Africa developed the West. He contends that Africa's impact on the West's technological rise was massive in terms of providing vital minerals such as uranium for atomic bombs and cobalt, indispensable for jet engines. See, all the time, you hear about cobalt, you hear about its technology being in cell phones, right? But this is just as great, maybe even greater. It's indispensable for jet engine. In some, Mazrui states, Africa's impact on the West's technological history in this phase, early to mid-20th century, was heavily based on Africa's industrial minerals. Mazrui further maintains that Africa, rather than benefiting from globalization, has become increasingly marginalized since the end of the Cold War in the late 1980s. He offers a long list of reasons why this marginalization has occurred, and here are 4 of the salient points. A, most of Africa has lost its strategic value, which motivated the big powers, the United States and the former USSR, to take it seriously. B, Africa has lost its socialist friends in the world affairs in the UN. Former members of the Warsaw Pact are now more eager to please the West than to support third world causes. C, Africa has lost its 1/3 numerical advantage in the United Nations. Some 20 new members have been admitted to the UN since 1990, only 2 of which are African, from Namibia and Eritrea. Others are former republics of the USSR collapse, Yugoslavia, and divided Czechoslovakia. D, the end of the Cold War has turned the West's old adversaries into Africa's rivals for the West's resources. Aid and investment will increasingly give greater priority to former members of the Warsaw Pact than to Africa. At bottom, this could suggest that the West has lost interest in Africa, as it no longer serves a purpose in terms of being a strategic geographical value, such as it did during the Cold War. If Mazrui is correct in his analysis, then Africa has to become self-reliant and internally productive. As difficult as this may be to achieve, the continent really has little options available. The present dog-eat-dog mentality will not benefit Africa as a whole in the long term. It's been a while since I've heard the term dog-eat-dog world. It's funny how some terms are always present for a period of time, and then they just go away after a while. However, Africa should not simply be left alone to deal with its problems, many of which have European roots. Mazrui puts forward 3 key suggestions that could aid Africa in terms of what he deems an interim reparation scheme. There needs to be long-term support for Africa through. Now, I'm going to read these 3 things, and I want you guys again, those of you who are live with me, those of you who are listening to the playback, I want you guys to respond. Do you think these three key suggestions as they're being described, right, should be our focus when it comes to Africa right now? Should they right now currently be our focus? Are they as important, right, or as key as the writer suggests? A, establishing or strengthening region-wide African institutions and promoting regional integration for greater African self-reliance. B, encouraging and helping to institutionalize national trends toward democratization in Africa, with resources for building democratic foundations, free press, election monitors, things of that nature. C, strengthening truly global coalitions for Africa, including new funding actors such as Japan, Taiwan, China, and South Korea, as well as traditional Western friends of Africa, partners, as well as reparationists. So are those things, do they make sense, right, to be considered key suggestions? The above are salient points that could take Africa forward. However, we also need to acknowledge that African nations have to forge the notion of self-reliance and cooperation among each other before there can be a new phase of external aid programs designed to help the continent. Without a framework for developing a long-term strategy for the continent's integration and independence, there is little chance in there being long-term sustainable recovery. Structure put forward by Mazrui for Africa's Renaissance is workable if the heads of Africa's nations re-educate and commit themselves to the notion of African unity that encompasses unified objectives such as wholesale African healthcare, economic and currency integration, a continental defense force, and a greater coordinated interstate and rail infrastructure across the continent. I could get down with all of that. This could be established via democratic principles and goal attainment within the embryonic African Union. So this brings us to this takes us to this next section called Africa Today. We check in with the chat room. In the chat room, I see NYC Beauties is in the house. That comment that Dorico Cooper made earlier that he edited says the African Union was going hard in the paint until Her Excellency Dr. Arika got fired. KW Don 7 is here. KW Don 7 says the African Union, as it is currently structured, is a neo-colonial flunky organization. It's an NCFL. It's an NCFO, a neo-colonial flunky organization. KW Don 7. That comment just before you from Dorico, saying that they were going hard in the paint until Dr. Arika got fired. Are you, KW Don 7, saying now they become this neo-colonial flunky organization? Or are you including even when Dr. Arika was involved? NYC Beauty says greetings. Greetings to you too as well. You guys make sure to check out NYC Beauties and all the photography, the videos, him capturing these beautiful women, beautiful black women. It's just nice. Dorico Cooper Photography says, when I was in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2012, my guide showed me the homes of some of Mobutu's cronies, and they still balling out of control from all the wealth that was stolen. Interesting. NYC Sports Archives is here saying hello, family. Hello to NYC Sports Archives. You guys also should check out their YouTube channel. He says, hello, Dorico Cooper Photography. Check out his YouTube channel as well. Says Mobutu stole more than King Leopold because Mobutu had a more developed economy to plunder. That's an interesting point, Dorico. That's an interesting point. The Pro-Black Perspective, of course, you must check out his channel on YouTube as well. Says, I take a, maybe a little bit B, but bruh could see his way out of here. Good one. I wish I had the clap track here, but good one. But for real, that C-Pod, that shit we're working with China and all those places, nah. The Regal Cool Photography says Africa is shaped like a revolver and Congo is its trigger. Whoever controls Congo controls Africa, and that's by France Fanon. Regal Cool also says the Congo alone is appraised by Urugu at $24 million in natural resource, $24 trillion in natural resource wealth. KW7 comes back, he says, they always were. The doctor was an exception, which is why she was dismissed. That makes sense, right? That makes sense. I wonder if it's possible to get her for an interview. To continue, Africa today. Overall, contemporary Africa continues to suffer as a continent in perpetual turmoil, and there is a definite need to explore creative ways of improving its health and socioeconomic condition. Time and time again, we are confronted with reports of an escalating AIDS crisis, endemic poverty, civil wars, and droughts leading widespread famine. The time is long overdue to develop long-term and sustainable strategies and initiatives that encourage genuine African unity to improve and free the continent from its contemporary maladies. Population statistics for the continent of Africa reveal that there was approximately 906 million people in 2004. The social indicators for contemporary Africa suggest that the health of the continent is heading into catastrophic decline, especially with the growing threat of AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria epidemics blighting its future. Along with the negative outlook for health, there is endemic social unrest and conflict because of sporadic civil wars, drought, and famine. To cap all this, the mounting debt crisis continues to afflict many African nations, and this further increases the growing poverty rates for the entire region. Take Zambia, for instance. Life expectancy is approximately 37 years and falling. Damn, I didn't know that. And debt payments cost 2/3 of the total resources for health and education combined. In Tanzania, even after debt relief, repayments are still more than health spending and about equal to those on education. In addition to its internal crises, Tanzania has often been the nation to brunt the main outcome of conflict between Burundi and Rwanda, especially in terms of accommodating refugees. It requires great cooperation before we will see an end to the Hutu and Tutsi conflict. The notion of African unity could help. Well, that's an interesting transition sentence there. Let's see what they're saying. So we had African unity. This section is called African unity. There is now arguably more than ever a need for stability and cooperation among African nations if they are to collectively rid the continent of such deep-rooted social problems. One of the major issues African leaders ought to address is the need for African unity and greater cooperation among and within the diverse nations. Too often, commentators imply that it is naive to think of the United States of Africa when there exists such a diversity in terms of culture, particularly in terms of language and religion. Okay. Yet, such difference has not denied European nations from forming the European Union and European Parliament in order to gain an integrated and unified bloc of nations cooperating on defense, economic, and political grounds. Indeed, European unity has not come together easily because of its history of conflict and interminable wars. However, Europe's diverse and conflicting history has not prevented its key contemporary leaders from working to produce the euro currency, European passport, and proposed European constitution. This begs the question, why cannot the African continent come together with an African currency, African passport, an African constitution, and parliament? So we'll see what the answer is, to his rhetorical question. But again, I say that a lot of writers never take into consideration that because of the situation Africa is currently in, for the reasons we are all aware of, right? They're not being allowed to, quote unquote, to create or come together and create, an African currency as well. But we see it as conflicts, right? We see it as conflicts. But who's creating the conflict? Like I've joked about in the past, like when I was growing up, there was a thing that kids used to do who were like an argument with one another. They would, one kid would pick up a little stone and say, hey, but the rock hot. And then if you hit the fella's hand, and of course the fella's antagonizing you with this quote unquote rock hot hand. If you feel antagonized, you push his hand away and the rock hits the other kid that you had the beef with. And so now it's a fight. That's largely what kind of goes on in Africa. Of course, the hand with the rock is a white one, right? The answer to such a question is entangled with notions of European hegemony and neocolonialism that are also deep-rooted in the continent's history of relative demise. Unlike Africa, Europe has not suffered its people being enslaved for hundreds of years, and its geographical space being overrun and colonized. In short, it is more difficult for African nations to gain unity compared to European nations. Yet given the fact that Africa is marginalized on the world stage of nations, it has little alternative but to find creative ways in creating solidarity among the many different peoples who belong there. Lessons have been passed down from the past, and they deserve recognition. Arguably, it has been Africans abroad who have provided the notion of African unity. What do you guys feel when you hear that last line there? Arguably, it has been Africans abroad who have provided the notion of African unity. What do you guys feel within yourselves when you hear that statement being made? All right? In the chat room, I see there's been some commentary. Kevin Carefoy 2 says, I've always said that many, if all of Africa's problems starts with its selfish and greedy leaders that sell out its future. People have to stand up to these relics of the past. The Rico Cooper Photography says the Congo is 3.5 times the size of Texas, with no functional government. When I was there, the army was not being paid, and some soldiers were stoned to death stealing chickens out of a citizen's yard. KW7 says Mobutu embezzled $14 billion for his personal use. Some of that money is still in offshore banks overseas. Crazy. Black Excellence is here, everybody. Black Excellence says, sorry, I'm late for class. Yeah, there should be some kind of detention for that, right? The Rico Cooper Photography says Congo does not even have roads to get from one side of the country to the other. You have to fly from one city to the others because the infrastructure is so bad. You know what's crazy about that? What's crazy about that is if you go back and you look at like the documentary on Lumumba, like to get from one part of Congo in the time and around the time when they assassinated him, you have to the same thing that Dorico just described. You have to fly to go from one side to the next. I thought that was interesting then, and to hear from someone who was in the Congo not too long ago say it now is just wild to me. Dorico Cooper says, I went to major university in Goma, Congo, that specializes in law, and they wrote the government to get funding to install proper plumbing and up-to-date bathrooms. As a result, 4 students were... Something happened to 4 students. You know what? I'll take a quick station ID break. I'll be back on the other side. I'll finish reading the comments and continue reading the paper.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Once again, also make sure you check out the Queen's Council podcast, also here on KWAZ Radio. Back to the chat room. Rico Cooper Photography had said, I went to a major university in Goma, Congo, that specializes in law, and they wrote the government to get funding to install proper plumbing and an up-to-date bathroom. As a result, 4 students were kidnapped and held by the Congo's version of the CIA. Interesting. Again, I want to thank everyone who's here tonight with me. I appreciate you guys for tuning in. Let's continue with the paper. This section is called Marcus Garvey, Africa, and the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Considering the overall impact of Marcus Garvey and his Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, which is the UNIA-ACL, both established 1914 in Jamaica, and particularly the UNIA in the United States during the early 1920s, the impact should be regarded as one of the wonders of the African and African diaspora experience. Why? Because it was a movement that for the first time galvanized masses of black people the world over in forging a new Negro who was unfettered by the psychology of racial inferiority. Indeed, the voluminous work accomplished by Garvey scholars testifies to the fact that Jamaican-born Marcus Garvey led the largest black mass movement in modern history. Before the 28-year-old Marcus Garvey arrived in the United States on March 23, 1916, he had already traveled far and wide throughout the Caribbean, Central and South America, and Europe, assessing the plight of peoples of African descent. Everywhere he went, he encountered black people enduring poverty-stricken conditions and racialized exploitation. These endemic conditions convinced Garvey to build a global movement to enable a resistance to the manifold forms of oppression at the hands of European and Euro-American imperialism. It was during his stay in England from 1912 to 1914 that he began to understand more about the struggles of African peoples on the continent under European colonialism, particularly while working in London with the journalist activist Deuce Mohammed, who ran the African Times and Orient Review. It is said that while he was in London, Garvey read Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery. This gave him the idea to build a school similar to Washington's Tuskegee Institute, and offered African Americans primarily industrial training in handicrafts and agriculture. More than this, it gave Garvey the idea to become a race leader, Garvey rapidly learned from men whom had preceded him, and he soaked up all the knowledge he could regarding the positive and factual history of Africa, especially that devoid of European bias. Everything that Garvey set out to achieve had Africa at the heart of his thinking. The prominent Garvey scholar, Professor Tony Martin, maintains Garvey saw Africa essentially as the only place where black people could launch a successful bid for equality with other races and nations. Africa was the black man's ancestral home. He was still in the majority there. The continent was rich in mineral resources, and if the black man became powerful in Africa, this would necessarily raise his status all over the world. And that's my belief as well. You guys might know this, or maybe this information is out there, maybe it's not. Was there a Garvey produced book list? Was there a Garvey produced booklet? I can't think of it now if I've ever seen it. You guys might know, but did Garvey himself ever, like how we read Dr. John Henrik Clarke the other night, and in that reading you could see him kind of listing off different books, right, that inspired that writing. Did Garvey ever produce like a book list? And I'll be curious what those books were. All right, you guys let me know if you know or not. All right, in the meantime, in short, Marcus Garvey wanted to redeem Africa's great past and liberate its present from European colonialism. His philosophy was basic. Without Africa being a free continent, there could be no way for peoples of African descent inside and outside of Africa to be free and respected human beings. The two aspects of African liberation were inextricably bound: free Africa, free and respected peoples. Moreover, one of the initial goals of the UNIA was to educate the millions of peoples of African heritage outside of Africa about the false and stereotype propaganda that made European civilization out to be vastly superior to anything that Africans had created. This in turn served as a way to justify the widespread exploitation of Africa and her peoples. Garvey was the major African diaspora leader in the early 20th century to see the importance of African self-development being linked to the development to black communities outside of her borders. Right? As Garvey put it, if we, African descendants of the Western world, take no interest in the higher development of the African natives, it will mean that in another 100 years, historians and writers will tell us that the black man once inhabited Africa, just as the North American Indian once inhabited America. But those of us who lead are well versed in Western civilization and are determined that the black man shall not be a creature of the past, but a full-fledged man of the present and a power to be reckoned with in the future. Although Garvey often used the Western language of his times, that could today be deemed slightly condescending in regard to African natives, needing enlightenment from Africans abroad. We talked about this. I talked about this, a couple months back, about that kind of language, right? However, to be fair, his emphasis was always on uplifting the consciousness of Africans on the continent and abroad in order to overcome the domination of Europeans in their collective lives. Yet today, there still seems to be an underestimation of the Garvey movement as it affected the psychological welfare among African descended peoples across the globe. This could be because of the fact that it is almost impossible to measure the psychology of uplift in terms of African descended peoples' struggle against white racism and its manifold negative effects on the psyche. But there is evidence that African peoples were uplifted and energized by the message of Marcus Garvey and the UNIA. Writing in regard to the positive impact of Garveyism in Nigeria, Africa, in 1920, Olusanya maintains Garvey's movement caught the imagination of Africans. This was because the socio-political, psychological climate in Africa favored it. By the 1920s, the whole of the African continent, except Ethiopia and Liberia, had been parceled out among European colonial powers, and Africans had been brought to the reality of colonization and its racial intolerance, economic exploitation, and social injustice. They were receptive to any movement which sought to emancipate them from European subjugation. It's therefore not surprising that a branch of the UNIA was organized in Nigeria in 1920. The credit for this goes to Reverend S.M. Abiodun and Reverend W.B. Iyuba. One cannot overestimate the loss of personal dignity and liberty that African peoples had endured under the yoke of colonialism. Yet, if we consider the impact of a liberation movement, which is what Garvey ultimately represented, it certainly did give hope to the disenfranchised Africans. Whether that hope is materialized in the here and now or later may well be immaterial. Indeed, psychological uplift gives hope, and hope can create freedom. Psychological uplift gives hope, and hope can create freedom. Indeed, time went on to reveal the power of Garvey to the African independence movement in the mid to late 20th century. Therefore, Osolanya is correct in his assessment, as Marcus Garvey was able to tap into the consciousness of Africans on the continent at a time when European colonial rule was at its height. By the early 1920s, the UNIA and established branches in the West, South, and Southwest of Africa, there would have probably been further UNIA footholds had it not been for the determined efforts of colonial authorities to quell its growth. The idea of African unity and self-determination sent alarm bells ringing along the colonial authorities. In an effort to suppress UNIA activity, colonial regimes banned circulation of the Negro world, the chief organ of Garveyism. Professor Tony Martin contends that in the case of the French authorities, they had been too late in banning UNIA literature, as Garvey had already organized the Senegalese via contact with key Africans in Europe. Although the UNIA had a vision to redeem all of Africa from colonial rule, it was on the potential settlement of Africans from the diaspora in Liberia that Garvey focused his main attention. Often coined the Back to Africa aspect of Garveyism, it has been much understood. At bottom, the Liberia Project from 1920 to 1924, if successful, would have given the UNIA a base to operate from on the continent. However, it is erroneous to think of the scheme as a quote-unquote mass migration of all African descendants in the diaspora. It was, to be sure, a form of resistance against colonialism, whereby Liberia would have been a starting point to self-determination, for example, by moving the UNI headquarters to Monrovia, capital of Liberia, and an eventual independent Africa. Eventually, with pressure coming from the British and French colonial authorities and U.S. business interests, the Liberian government reneged on the promises of land and settlement rights of the UNIA. In addition to this, there was growing opposition from the ruling Americo-Liberian elite, who had benefited as a comprador class. They did not want to see an anti-colonial movement led by Garvey in Liberia. Ain't that the bitch right there, huh? All right. Ain't that the bitch there? All right. I see in the chat room there's been some activity. Dorico Kuba Photography says many of the people living in Goma, that's the Congo, are displaced from mining companies that have taken over their land and just started mining for gold, copper, coltan, diamond, uranium, tin, and more. He goes on to say the Congo is rich in diamonds, that they have diamonds and black folk mining them on the currency. Okay. The pro-black perspective says he recommended some white books and message to the people. This is only thing I say is answering the question: did Garvey generate like a reading list, a book list? Did he leave that behind? The pro-black perspective says, but generally he advised we read a lot. Yeah, that's true. Garvey always said to always read. Drico Cool Photography says, that would be fine as long as you're not reading it with a falsified consciousness. It is a great book if you read it like a political science book. So I missed something just now. Yeah, the pro-black perspective says, unfortunately, he thought we should read the Bible daily. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. And I talked about this recently, and I think Garvey is an example of it. Like, there was a time where that's all black folks really did was get into some Abrahamic religion. You know, so it's not surprising. You go back 100 years, 200, 100, 150 years, not surprising that a lot of the folks that we hold dearly practice some Abrahamic religion. You know, that's just what those folks did. You know, this is where Dorico responds and says that will be fine as long as you're not reading it with a falsified consciousness. Talking about the Bible now. It is a great book if you read it like a political science textbook. The Bible is also a great astrology text. Dorico Cooper Photography goes on to say, especially when you get or hold all the so-called lost books or uninspired books of the Bible, such as the Book of Enoch. Full list of all the lost books is on the Discord. To continue. But yeah, we see where the elite didn't want Garvey setting foot there. So it wasn't just the British, but it was the folks on the ground, Liberian, the American/Liberian elite, who didn't want Garvey there because they didn't want him messing up their thing. They didn't want him putting his hands in their pocket, so to speak. All right. The first biographer of Garvey wrote, quote, certainly the British and French had good reason to fear the impact of Garvey's African nationalism upon their colonies. That good reason to fear was because of the fact that the UNIA had been successful. Now, if the UNIA had been successful, it may have ushered in a post-World War independence movement for Africa. Instead, it was to become a post-World War II phenomenon. The Garvey movement played a massive role in giving future African leaders a much-needed psychological boost toward gaining the fight for independence. Among those Africans who benefited from the ideas of Garvey are Nnamdi Azikiwe, Nigeria Governor General, Jomo Kenyatta, Kenyan Prime Minister 1960, President 1964, Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana President 1957, Kenneth Kaunda, Zambia President 1964, and others. Without a doubt, Marcus Garvey gave a tremendous psychological boost to the health of African independence struggles that ushered in the winds of change that swept across the continent from the 1950s onward. In a 1963 semi-autobiographical account, Amy Jacques Garvey, his second wife, put into perspective her pride in the work of her husband as it related to Africa's freedom from colonialism. It says, Marcus Garvey was never privileged to set foot on African soil. He was always denied entry to any territory and warned that he was an agitator and would suffer grave consequences if he were discovered there in disguise. so the dearest wish of his heart was not accomplished. So it was with gratification and joy that I received a cabled invitation from the Nigerian government to attend the inaugural ceremonies of the installation of Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe as Governor General of Nigeria in November 1960. Yeah, you know, you often get these critiques of Garvey. Oh, how come he never went to Africa himself? Well, there you go. There you go. And low key, you know what else you go? A lot of black folks who had left America and went back to Liberia were the ones who didn't want him to, who didn't want him there. There you go. You're welcome. Marcus Garvey was unable to set foot on African soil, but his ideas were in place for future generations of Africans to follow through his vision of a united continent that was independent of external interference. Even though it has been proven that direct European colonialism was not good for Africa, the continent can still not be considered free from negative outside forces along with internal strife. The contemporary scene is not particularly inspiring, and there is need for a concerted effort in providing a unified approach to the current problems that are definitely harming the road to a prosperous future. The next 2 decades are going to be crucial for Africa's health as a continent. The current leaders could do no harm in considering the concept of African unity. This brings us to a section called Towards the United States of Africa. As noted above, the unification of Africa was a long-cherished goal for many African and African diaspora leaders in the 19th century, notably Garvey in the 1920s, followed by Nkrumah in the 1960s. Kwame Nkrumah tried passionately and vigorously to be a leader of African unity on the continent. His role as the first elected African president of Ghana in the 20th century put him in the political spotlight for finding ways to free the rest of Africa from colonialism. He understood more than anyone that this would be an extremely difficult task because of the diversity of cultures and histories, yet he never gave up on the issue of commonality, of experience that could bind the continent together in terms of economic and political expediencies. At the height of African independence struggles against European colonialism, Nkrumah wrote, "There are those who maintain that Africa cannot unite because we lack the 3 necessary ingredients for unity: a common race, culture, and language. It is true that we have for centuries been divided. The territorial boundaries dividing us were fixed long ago, often quite arbitrarily. By the colonial powers. Some of us are Muslims, some Christians, many believe in traditional tribal gods. Some of us speak French, some English, some Portuguese, not to mention the millions who speak one of the hundreds of different African languages. We have acquired cultural differences that affect our outlook and condition our political development." Nkrumah was cognizant of the problems facing the possibility of African unity, but he did not view it as impossible to achieve. He felt that Africans had more in common than they had in difference, and this would ultimately be the guiding block to greater unity. As he stated, quote, "I can best describe this as a sense of oneness in that we are Africans," end of quote. In line with the 19th century champion of African liberation, Edward Wilmot Blyden, and following the work of Marcus Garvey, Nkrumah expressed the quote-unquote African personality via a Pan-African frame of reference. No doubt such a revelation would be deemed as essentialist today, but in a general sense, the African personality speaks to shared experiences, customs, and spiritual values. Whatever the differences, it was argued they were far outweighed by the commonalities among Africans. When one considers the demarcation line created by Western domination, it is understandable how and why African leaders such as Nkrumah sought to find commonality among Africans on the continent. And just a quick question here. Do you guys think Nkrumah was a narcissist who was really just concerned with being the man who liberated all of Africa? Do you think that's what, Nkrumah thought of himself? Like, I'm just going to be the man. I'm going to be on, in busts and pictures and flags. And was that Nkrumah's problem? Really? Dorico Cooper Photography says the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman is a great book to help one understand the pressure and danger that foreign heads of state are subjected to by jackals and economic hitmen if they don't obey Western powers. Yeah, we've talked about this in the past too, that, we've talked about the reward and punishment system. And ultimately, we are not going to be able to ever compete unless we have a better than white folks' reward and punishment system. If we don't ever get that, we're done. We will never be again. You got to get that going. Nkrumah was a Pan-Africanist at heart, and he was inspired by the thought of an African continent enabled and empowered in self-sufficiency. Kwame Nkrumah also warned against neocolonialism and the subsequent fragmentation of African nations. With this in mind, contemporary African leaders in the newly devised African Union need specific goals that empower their individual nations, along with the entire continent. Tackling the health of the continent alone should be enough to bring African nations together. How do you guys feel about that? Right? How do you guys feel about that? That just tackling the health issue in Africa should bring about African unity, right? I saw someone on Twitter mention like Kenyans creating a cure for AIDS back in the day. I remember that, and I also remember they found that it didn't do much. I think there was 2 cures actually. Cameron was one, and the other one was a herbal remedy. I forgot the name now. The Pearl or something? Oh, I forgot the name now, but it was a herbal remedy. And according to the news, the media, it wasn't very good at curing or doing anything really in light of persons being infected with HIV or AIDS. And KW Don 7 says Nkrumah was a joker who was too busy skinning and grinning with Western leaders like Kennedy. Yeah, but the skinning and grinning, okay, so I guess the skinning and grinning would mean that he wasn't really about nothing. But to me, when I read Nkrumah, and the more and more I study Nkrumah, it seems to me that he was this dude who just wanted, kind of to be the first Negro to do anything. Like how we always see that in the States. Oh, so-and-so is the first black to do such and such. It seems like he just wanted all the accolades, right? And it kind of seems like if he could have been president of all the countries in Africa, he would esteem to be that. It's just weird. With over 30 million HIV cases, the AIDS issue has to be high on the agenda for the foreseeable future. Fragmentation of Africa has to stop before it disintegrates into chaos. Neocolonialism has no place in these extremely dangerous times of pandemics and epidemics. Those powerful nations of the West need only to aid Africa in the spheres of medical treatments and debt relief. Interference beyond this will lead only to further disintegration of the continent. The African Union should learn from the past and try to put aside small differences for the good of the continent. Africa is no longer a Cold War regional battleground, as the West has little interest in Africa compared to in previous eras. Therefore, Africa in some ways is free to build itself again. I think this is a little bit wishful thinking, but okay. The 21st century can actually be viewed as a positive era when African nations truly begin the work of working together for the health of the continent. It is not a naive proposition to think of Africa for the Africans in the 21st century. This brings us to the conclusion of the paper. Once again, I want to thank all of you for being here, for tuning in, and hanging out with me as we get a little bit more knowledge, scholarly, academic type knowledge, about our situation. The conclusion goes, this article has considered a contemporary notion of African unity in the historical context of Marcus Garvey and the UNIA-ACL. It has been contended that even though Marcus Garvey was not successful in the 1920s in securing outright victory over European colonialism, he did lay the foundations for the following generation of African leaders from the continent and diaspora to engage in the effective liberation of Africa in terms of direct European rule post-World War II. However, since the 1960s, there has been limited progress in securing a viable and sustainable notion and practice of African unity on the continent. We have witnessed the fall of apartheid, an end of white supremacy rule on the continent, but the continent's economic and social health is floundering as the poorest region in the world. Have we witnessed the fall? Right? Have we witnessed the fall of apartheid and the end of white supremacy rule on the continent? Have we really witnessed it? Right? The continent's economic and social health is floundering as the poorest region in the world with the lowest life expectancy rates. It has been argued that here needs to be a re-emphasis on African unity, whereby a concerted effort on behalf of African national leaders focuses on how to effectively move the continent forward in terms of proactive interdependency. It has also been suggested that if Europe can find ways, however difficult the pathway, to develop a European Union that works for the betterment of that region, then Africa can do the same. Right? And I agree with that. Despite the bullshit, we can do the same. There's one major difference in this comparison, and that is in the fact that European nations have not suffered the indignity of being colonized or had their natural resources exploited for hundreds of years. This is a significant differential in regard to Africa's immediate socioeconomic problems. Yet it is not impossible to overcome this unfortunate historical situation. With the cooperation of Europe, Africa can rebuild itself, unify for the good of the world, peace, and create a prosperous continent. See, this is the foolishness that I don't like. All right? This is the wishful thinking. Why would Europe help you to build you into a power? It is not naive to the previous statement was naive, but this one says it's not naive to think of Africa as an economic powerhouse from north to south and east to west. It has the natural resources, and with the aid of Europe, without interference, Africa could become a major player on the world stage. But that begs the question: why would Europe aid in that? Without a proactive response to the current negative situation, there can be only decades of despair to come. Indeed, the future of the African continent is not looking particularly bright with the HIV/AIDS pandemic, poverty, and starvation in certain regions, along with the mounting refugee crisis in war-torn areas. Who is to blame? Maybe it's time to put culpability on both African leaders and European leaders. After all, accountability must find a home. Some would argue that the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, as economic bastions, I would say bastards, of the West, created the poverty in African nations by placing excessive demands on both loan and aid criteria. There is at least a kernel of truth in that perspective, but it is not enough of an excuse. African leaders should now, in this day, be aware of how neocolonialism operates. I agree. Either they are part of the problem or part of the solution. The blueprint for African unity has been articulated and stands today as a testimony to what can still be achieved. Western powers need to be aware that the continued instability of Africa can no longer be useful to a positive notion of globalization. The interdependence of the world's resources gives notice that it is better to prepare for peace among peoples than to perpetuate unrest by either direct or indirect means. Kwame Nkrumah may have made mistakes in rapidly modernizing Ghana, but his effort is also a good example of how the West can thwart African progress. So why is he talking the way he's spoken in previous parts of the paper? How the West can thwart African progress with insidious interference to impede African progress towards a self-sufficient and self-sustaining continent. It is mere conjecture now to think of what could have been if the West had not interfered with Nkrumah's effort to achieve African unity. Any student of history can learn from the past that Western powers made it difficult for Africa to move on positively and prosperously after the fall of European colonialism. We also know now that Africa became a battleground for Cold War politics in the immediate post-colonial era. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there was no real need for Africa as a region to fight communism, and most Western eyes shifted to the Middle East and the quote-unquote new enemies led by Al-Qaeda. Africa is, as Professor Mazrui contends, between marginalization and globalization. Neither here nor there, Mr. In-Between, Mazrui sees Africa at an important juncture or crossroads in her existence. Yet when studying a map of the world, Africa can still be viewed as being at the heart of the world. It is metaphorically and sadly a broken heart. After many decades of external exploitation and internal strife, a broken heart can heal with time, and the experience often makes the heart stronger and wiser. For it to regain its health, the continent should heed the words of the great Pan-Africanist W.E.B. Du Bois in 1965. If Africa unites, it will be because each part, each nation, each tribe gives up part of its heritage for the good of the whole. That is what union means. That is what Pan-Africa means. When a child is born into the tribe, the price of his growing up is giving a part of his freedom to the tribe. This, he soon learns, or dies. The tribe becomes a union of tribes. The individual tribe surrenders some part of its freedom to the paramount tribe. At bottom, Marcus Garvey and Kwame Nkrumah were right. For the good of its future health and its neighbors, Africa must unite. Unity within Africa will promote both physical and mental well-being for all. The world now requires a healthy heart, arguably more than it ever did. African leadership needs to be proactive and put an end to civil wars and cultural rivalries. European leadership needs to be non-reactive and provide assistance without economic strings and penalties. Genuine partnership without hierarchy is what Africa needs in its future relations with the West. Let us take the best from the past and leave the worst behind. The world will be a safer place with internal cooperation based on mutual understanding and respect for all on this earth. Africa's descendants on the continent and in the diaspora need to continue the work of the great pioneers, Blyden, Garvey, Du Bois, Nkrumah, Kenyatta, Mandela, and many other men and women to unite the many roads that lead us back to Africa and to an ultimate United States of Africa. I know some of y'all have some problems with some of those names. They're Blyden, Garvey, Du Bois, Nkrumah, Kenyatta, Mandela, and many other men and women to unite the many roads that lead us back to Africa, to an ultimate United States of Africa. That right there is the paper. Hope you guys enjoyed the paper. Let me see what the chat is talking about. So Dorico Cooper Photography says, look what happened to President Magufuli for not co-signing with Western countries on the Rona shot. Yep. Brother's gone. Dorico goes on to say the healthcare piece is critical. All the heads of state in Africa go to Europe for healthcare. No, we cannot speculate about the number of reasons they do that, but healthcare is certainly behind the times. Gaddafi was funding all kinds of projects on the continent, so much so that the Libyan people, jealous of the support and aid that he was giving to impoverished African countries, he was doing for Africa. Western countries hated that, and that is why they took him out. The gold dinar, African Communications Satellite, African Monetary Fund, AMF to replace IMF. That's okay. African Monetary Fund, the AMF, African Central Bank of Investment, Desert Water Project. These are a list of things Gaddafi was doing, it would seem. Dorico, do you also feel that Gaddafi was, I mean, even with this said, do you think he was an Arab opportunist? Do you think he was still an Arab opportunist? Dorico goes on to say, next thing you know, NATO shut down the Libyan airspace. Yeah, I talked a little bit recently about NATO and what they do. Make sure you guys follow KWAZ Radio. Make sure to follow the YouTube channel. Let's grow that channel as well, so we can get that channel to doing some nice things for all the shows on the podcast network. Anyway, that's our paper tonight. I want to thank everyone who was here. Let me go through the list. Dorico Cooper Photography also says they want you to think that, but I don't. So Dorico doesn't think he was an Arab opportunist. Okay. Dorico Cooper Photography was here. KWAZ Radio. Who else was here? KW Don 7 was here with us. The Pro Black Perspective with Only Say was here. Dorico Cooper Photography. Sorry, Dorico Cooper Photography was here, of course. Who else was here? Kevin Care 482 was in the room. I mentioned KW Don 7. NYC Beauties was here. NYC Sports Archives was here. And Black Excellence was here. Thank all of you folks for being here tonight. I hope you enjoyed this paper. There was something I just said I was going to do. Oh yeah, I'm going to post this video on the Conscious Videos. I'm going to post this, the replay of this debate on Abrahamic religions that they had, I think it was yesterday. Funny enough, the guy who probably started the conversation, Only to Say, wasn't included. I saw Alma Bookman was there, Slank, my man from Philly, what's his name again? Omawali was there. So I'll post that in the Conscious Videos, and by all means, I like everyone to check it out and comment on it. We had a little bit of a discussion in the chat tonight from Dorico about believe, reading the Bible and all that stuff. So I'm going to post that video in Conscious Videos. You guys, make sure to check it out and comment on the video. Make sure to check it out and comment on the video. Well, until Saturday, shoot the breeze. I bid you peace and farewell. All right, peace to everyone. I'll talk to you guys on Saturday for Shoot the Breeze. If you have comments or topics you want us to discuss, post those in the Discord and off topic, and I'll jot those down for us to discuss on Saturday. Shoot the Breeze. Dorico Cooper Photography says another great paper, definitely food for thought. Appreciate it. Appreciate all of you guys. Until next time, peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.